Okay. So have you ever had that feeling, you know, where it's like something bad is coming and you just,
You can feel it.
yeah, feel it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Even though nothing's actually happened yet, you start changing how you act.
like you're already bracing yourself.
Exactly. Exactly. And that right there, that's a big red flag. Authoritarians love that.
It's like giving up before the game even starts.
And Timothy Snyder, he calls it obeying in advance. It's like extra relevant right now.
It's some familiar faces maybe coming back into
You
power.
said it. Okay, so for this deep dive, we're digging into Snyder's books, The Phantom Campaign, and On Tyranny.
We'll be looking at how this obeying in advance plays out, for everyday people.
But also for like massive corporations too, right?
Oh, absolutely. We'll even talk about Google. I mean, we're talking about a tech giant.
A behemoth.
Yeah. Worth like 6 times more than President Musk. And even they seem to be, kind of adjusting already.
Adjusting to what?
Well, seemingly to the incoming administration.
You're kidding. Like they're already getting nervous, even with all that power and money.
It seems that way.
So if Google's already kind of like caving, what hope is there for the rest of us?
That's the million-dollar question.
Okay, so then let's get into it. Let's talk about this phantom. What is it, and how does it even work?
So Snyder, he lays it out pretty clearly. It's this mix of a few things.
Like what?
Okay, so oligarchic money, for starters.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then you've got all that psychographic data they're collecting on us.
Wait, hold up. Psychographic data? What even is that?
It's like, imagine someone builds this super detailed profile of you, right? But it's not just basic stuff.
Like age, location, that kind of thing.
Right. It goes deeper. It's your personality, your fears, your hopes, even your deepest insecurities.
Oh, wow, that's kind of creepy.
And they use this data to target people with very specific messages designed to get a certain reaction.
So it's like they're manipulating us without us even realizing it.
Basically.
And this is all part of this phantom campaign.
Yeah.
And Snyder's saying this stuff actually works. Like it's not just some conspiracy theory.
Oh, it has real-world consequences.
Give me an example.
Well, Snyder argues that this kind of phantom campaign, it might have played a big role in Clinton's loss in 2016.
Really?
And he sees signs of it happening again, even in the recent election against Harris specifically.
He doesn't just pull this out of thin air, right? Like, where's he getting this from?
There's some reporting on this in the Washington Post.
Okay, so there's actual evidence.
Yep. And it's not just about swaying votes either. It's about creating this atmosphere of, like, apathy.
Making people feel like their vote doesn't even matter.
Right. Like, the system is rigged, so why even bother?
Wow. That's scary stuff.
Snyder even shared this story in his newsletter from one of his readers.
Oh, yeah. What happened?
So this reader felt like they were being targeted by these demotivational messages.
During the election.
Yeah, and what's interesting is they noticed this one attack on Harris, right? Criticizing a policy.
That she supported or something.
Well, supposedly. But get this. The policy was actually enacted by Trump himself.
So they're straight up lying.
It's a blatant manipulation tactic.
They're trying to make us doubt our own memories like we don't even know was real anymore.
And that's exactly where self-censorship becomes a danger.
Because if we're always second-guessing ourselves, we're less likely to, I don't know.
Speak up.
Yes, speak up, take a stand, all of that.
Snyder uses this really chilling historical example to show just how dangerous this preemptive obedience can be.
Oh, yeah.
What is it?
He talks about Nazi Germany and how, like, the whole regime, it wouldn't have been possible if civil servants hadn't already started, changing how they did their jobs.
Before they were even ordered to.
Exactly. They started disabling parts of their work that had anything to do with human rights.
They were just, like, anticipating what they thought the regime wanted.
It's adjusting accordingly.
Man, that's wild. It's like they were obeying in advance, and it paved the way for some horrific things.
That's the danger of it. So then how do we break free from that? How do we resist this urge to obey in advance?
Well, according to Snyder, it all starts with truth.
Like being really careful about the information we consume.
Exactly. We have to be like super critical consumers, especially in this day and age with social media and all that. And Snyder says we have to avoid becoming what he calls an epistemic 17-year-old.
Okay, I think I get it, but break it down for me.
You know that teenager who thinks they know everything and they're just like cynical about everything?
Yeah, been there, done that.
We can't afford that when it comes to authoritarianism. We can't just tune out and say, it's all fake news anyway.
So we have to engage, even if it's uncomfortable.
Yes. Critically evaluate sources, even if they tell us what we want to hear.
Okay, but that's the tough part. Like, who do we even trust anymore? Where do we go for good information?
Snyder says to focus on, like, investigative journalists.
Why them?
Their job is to uncover facts, not to sensationalize or push an agenda.
They're the ones digging through all the noise. So support local journalism, folks. That's one small act of defiance we can all do.
Absolutely. It's a start.
Okay, so we need to be vigilant about the information we consume.
Yes.
But what about actually doing something? How do we, like, turn this awareness into real-world action?
Well, there's this practical guide called Indivisible, a practical guide for democracy on the brink. It has some great tips.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What does it say?
The first thing is, it reminds us that democracy, it's definitely under threat.
Right.
But it's not dead yet. And we, the citizens, we still have power, especially at the local level.
I like that.
And the guide gives us some specific things we can do to actually make our voices heard by those in power.
Like, get off social media and do something.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
It's about being more strategic.
Okay, so what kind of strategies are we talking about?
Well, things like personalized emails, actually calling your elected officials.
Like on the phone?
Yeah, old school, I know, but it works. Attending town halls, showing up at their offices.
That good stuff.
Yeah, it carries more weight than just, signing a petition online or something.
Because it shows you're actually committed.
Exactly. It's harder to ignore someone who's standing right there in front of you.
I guess so.
And another thing the guide says is we can't just repeat what we did back in 2017. Things have changed.
So what's different this time around?
Well, elected officials, they've gotten a lot more savvy about handling all this, constituent pressure.
Like they're dodging us.
Kinda. They're being more careful, sticking to friendly media, avoiding tough questions.
So we have to be even more strategic.
Exactly.
Okay, but how do we do that? How do we know where to focus our energy?
It depends. You got to look at your own local political landscape.
Right.
Maybe you have a governor who's on your side, but your state legislature is a nightmare.
Been there.
So you got to assess the playing field. Find those pressure points where your actions can actually make a difference.
Don't waste your energy on battles you're not going to win.
Yeah, exactly. Be smart about it. And those local indivisible groups, they can help with that.
How so?
They're already plugged in.
They know the local scene?
Yep, they know the players, the issues.
Strength in numbers, right.
Exactly. Plus, you get support, motivation, all of that. It helps when things feel overwhelming.
Okay, so we've talked about what individuals can do. But what about those big corporations we were talking about before? What's their role in all this?
That's where things get, well, maybe a little uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable how?
Well, we tend to think of corporations as these, untouchable giants, right?
Yeah, kind of.
But the truth is, even they can fall into this trap of obeying in advance.
You're saying Google's a prime example of that.
I think so.
I mean, if a company with that much power and influence is seemingly caving, what does that say to the rest of us?
It kind of sets a bad precedent, doesn't it?
It almost makes it seem like that's the only option.
And that's why it's important to contrast Google's approach with someone like Musk, right?
The guy's a total wild card.
But Snyder pointed out that Musk actively campaigned against Harris and for Trump.
Even though it was controversial.
He used his platform. He took a stand.
Whether you love him or hate him,
Wow.
he wasn't afraid to, make some noise.
And it forces us to ask, what is the responsibility of people and companies with that much influence?
Especially when it comes to, standing up to authoritarianism.
Exactly. It's a tough question.
But one thing's for sure.
What's that?
Silence isn't always the answer. Sometimes speaking out, even when it's risky, is the most responsible thing to do.
Which brings us back to obeying in advance, right?
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we always have a choice.
We can go along to get along.
Or we can resist.
Stand up for what we believe in.
Even when it's hard. And that's what we'll be exploring in part 2 of our deep dive.
We'll look at actual examples of people who are doing just that, resisting this urge to obey in advance.
Stay tuned for that.
We'll be back after a short break. So before the break, we were talking about Google and this idea of even big corporations kind of caving to this pressure to obey in advance.
Yeah, and how that can really set a dangerous example for everyone else.
It normalizes it,
Exactly.
Which brings us back to this point that Snyder makes on tyranny. He talks about how authoritarian regimes, they intentionally try to blur the truth.
It's not even just about straight up lying all the time. It's more about making it so hard to even figure out what's real anymore.
So we just get exhausted and give up.
Exactly. We throw up our hands and say, whatever, it's all fake news anyway.
And that plays right into their hand.
Oh, absolutely. They want us to feel overwhelmed, confused, and ultimately powerless.
Like, we don't even have the energy to fight back. It's like death by a thousand cuts.
Yeah, it's insidious. And that's why Snyder is so adamant about staying informed, seeking out those reliable sources, engaging in critical thinking.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds simple enough, but it's so hard to do these days.
It is. But think about it this way. If we just give up on the truth altogether, we lose our ability to hold those in power accountable.
We're basically giving them a free pass to do whatever they want.
Exactly. So by clinging to the truth, by refusing to let go of the facts, even when it's hard, we're actually resisting this obey in advance mentality.
We're saying, no, we're not going to let you gaslight us. We're going to hold you to account.
Exactly. And another way we can resist is through what Snyder calls corporeal politics.
Corporeal politics. Okay, you're going to have to explain that one to me.
It's basically about getting out from behind our screens,
Yeah.
engaging with the world physically.
So less tweeting and more town hall meetings.
Exactly. Remember that Indivisible guide we were talking about? They have some great tips for making that kind of real-world engagement happen.
Let's dig into those a bit more. What kind of stuff do they recommend?
Well, one of the big things they emphasize is connecting with your elected officials on a personal level.
Like actually talking to them.
Yeah. Writing personalized emails, making phone calls, going to town halls, showing up at their office hours.
Because that cuts through all the noise, right?
Mhm.
It's not just another form letter or a tweet that gets lost in the algorithm.
Exactly. It shows that you're a constituent who's invested enough to make your voice heard directly.
And I bet it's a lot harder for them to ignore someone who's standing right there in front of them,
Oh.
Makes it more real.
Exactly. And another thing the Indivisible Guide points out is that we can't just rely on the same playbook from 2017.
Things have changed.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The political landscape is different now, so we have to adapt our strategies.
Okay, so what's different this time around? What do we need to be aware of?
Well, for one thing, elected officials have gotten a lot more savvy about managing constituent pressure. They're not as accessible as they used to be.
So they're trying to avoid us.
Kind of, yeah. They're sticking to friendly media outlets, avoiding situations where they might face tough questions. They're being more careful.
So we have to be even more strategic about how we engage.
Exactly. We need to focus our energy where our actions can have the most impact.
Okay, but how do we figure that out? How do we know where to focus our efforts?
Well, it really depends on your local political landscape. Every situation is different.
Right.
Maybe you have a governor who's great, but your state legislature is a nightmare. Or maybe you live in a blue city in a red state. The point is, you have to assess the playing field and figure out where you can make a difference.
Don't waste energy on battles you can't win.
Exactly. And that's another area where those local indivisible groups can be so helpful.
They have their finger on the pulse, so to speak.
They're plugged in, they know the players, the issues, the dynamic.
Strength in numbers too, right?
For sure. Plus, being part of a group can provide support, motivation, a sense of solidarity. It really helps when things feel overwhelming. It's a lot easier to stay engaged when you're not doing it alone.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked a lot about individual action, what we can do as citizens. But what about those corporations we were talking about earlier? What role did they play in all this?
That's a really interesting question, and maybe a bit of an uncomfortable one.
Uncomfortable how?
Well, we tend to think of corporations as these huge, powerful entities, almost untouchable, right?
Yeah, I get that.
But the truth is, even they can fall prey to this temptation to obey in advance.
And as we've seen with Google, it can have a ripple effect throughout society.
Exactly. If a company with Google's resources and influence is seemingly cowed by the incoming administration, what message does that send to smaller businesses, to individuals?
It normalizes that behavior, almost makes it seem like the only option.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to contrast Google's approach with someone like Musk.
Yeah, that guy's a total wild card.
But remember, Snyder pointed out that Musk actively campaigned against Harris and for Trump, even though it was controversial.
He used his platform, he took a stand.
He wasn't afraid to make some noise, whether you agree with him or not. And that forces us to confront some uncomfortable questions.
Like, what is the responsibility of individuals and corporations with that much influence, especially when it comes to facing down authoritarianism?
Yeah, it's a complex issue with no easy answers, but one thing's for sure, silence isn't always golden. Sometimes speaking out, even when it's risky, is the most responsible thing to do.
Which brings us back to this idea of obeying in advance,
Yeah.
right? It's about recognizing that we always have a choice.
We can choose to be passive, to go along, to get along. Or we can choose to resist, to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's difficult.
Because sometimes the smallest act of defiance can have a ripple effect that we can't even imagine.
Absolutely. And that's what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at specific examples of individuals and groups who are resisting this urge to obey in advance and making a real difference in their communities. Stay tuned for that.
It's inspiring stuff, folks. We'll be back after a short break to wrap things up. Don't go anywhere. So we've spent this whole deep dive talking about this idea of obeying in advance.
How it can be this like sneaky tool of authoritarianism.
Yeah. And we talked about how important it is to, seek out the truth and how both people and big companies need to resist this urge to just like self-censor.
Right. Not just shut down and stay silent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we touched on some practical stuff too from Snyder and that Indivisible Guide about actually taking action.
Putting it all into practice.
But I think it helps to get even more specific, Like, what does resistance actually look like in the real world? What are people doing to push back against this pressure to conform?
There are so many great examples. Remember those local indivisible groups we talked about?
Yeah, yeah.
They're a perfect example of people coming together and saying, we're not going to just sit back and let this happen.
They're not waiting for permission or anything.
Nope. They're taking initiative, organizing, mobilizing, putting pressure on their elected officials, especially at the local level.
Which is so important, right?
Mhm.
Because local politics is where a lot of this stuff actually plays out.
Absolutely. It's where policies are implemented, where they have a direct impact on people's lives.
It's not just some abstract concept.
And people often feel more empowered to make a difference at that level, too.
Because it's their community, right? They know the people, the issues.
Exactly. And they can actually see the results of their actions, which can be really motivating.
It's not just about fighting for some big, abstract principle. It's about making their own corner of the world a better place.
And those groups aren't just focused on national politics either. They're tackling all sorts of things.
Like what?
Affordable housing, protecting the environment, social justice issues, all kinds of stuff.
So they're building a better future, brick by brick, you could say.
I like that. And it proves that you don't need to be some billionaire like Musk or a giant corporation to make a difference.
You just need to be willing to show up and do the work.
And find others who share your values and work together.
Solidarity, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so for our listeners who are like fired up now and want to get involved, where do they even start? How do they find these local groups?
The Indivisible Guide website is a great resource. They have a whole directory of groups all over the country.
And if there's not one nearby,
Start your own. It really doesn't take much to get the ball rolling. Just a handful of dedicated people can make a huge difference.
it's like that old saying, be the change you want to see in the world.
Exactly. And remember, this isn't just about resisting one particular politician or party. It's about defending democracy itself.
Those core values,
Yeah.
right? Truth, justice, accountability.
All the things that make a free society possible.
So it's bigger than just this moment in time. It's about shaping the kind of world we want to live in, the kind of future we want for ourselves and our kids.
And that future is ours to create.
So what's the biggest takeaway you want our listeners to remember from all of this?
Don't give in to fear. Don't let the pressure to obey in advance shut you down. We all have a voice, and it's more important than ever to use it.
Find your voice, find your people, and get to work.
Yes. Find your power.
Well said. And to our listeners, we say stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay hopeful. The fight for democracy is far from over, and we need all hands on deck. So thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it's given you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to take action.
Keep questioning. Keep pushing. Keep fighting for the world you want to see.
And until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop questioning.
And never, ever obey in advance.